Hello, my name is Kimberly Kaiser, and I'm going to be sharing with you a presentation given at the Association for Psychological Science conference in 2025. And this is a project that was done in the laboratory at Fielding Graduate University, which I'm part of. And I'd like to thank my co-author, Angelique or Angie Akito, and my mentor and research advisor, Christine Jacqueline. The title of this presentation is Different Symptoms, PTSD Symptom Clusters Predict Various Forms of Sexual Dysfunction. And I'm going to start with a quote by Judith Herman, which was one of my first introductions to trauma work and the impacts of trauma. In the very early years of my psychology studies at Beth Israel Hospital in New York City. And I didn't know at the time that it would be so relevant to what I am doing today. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. People who have survived atrocities often tell their stories in a highly emotional, contradictory, and fragmented manner that undermines their credibility and thereby serves the twin imperatives of truth-telling and secrecy. When the truth is finally recognized, survivors can begin their recovery, but far too often secrecy prevails. And the story of the traumatic event surfaces not in a verbal narrative, but as a symptom. And I'll start by just sharing a little about myself. The majority of my career has been as a sex therapist. For many years, I've listened carefully to my patients, not only what they were saying, but by observing the structure and the way they were holding their physical bodies and what they were not saying. And I started primarily as a sex therapist, but few patients presenting with any type of sexual dysfunction did not present a history of childhood maltreatment, so abuse or neglect. And this led me to become a trauma therapist, and I trained in EMDR and internal family systems. My training in trauma therapy was in many ways initiated by my patients. After years of seeing the transformation of symptoms of sexual dysfunction kind of give way to these narratives so people could put into words, what their experiences were, I started to see that sexual health and mental health were restored. And I became curious about why I was not finding more information about these complex relationships in the literature or the clinical trainings that I was receiving. And I felt deeply compelled to understand how these biopsycho-relational aspects of sexual functioning could be disrupted in adulthood by events that occurred so long ago, and how by addressing those restored sexual functioning. So the research being presented here today are part of a larger study that our lab conducted on this topic. The research questions specific to this presentation strive to understand what the relationship between the specific type of PTSD symptom cluster and the type of sexual dysfunction. And our hypothesis was that if symptoms of sexual dysfunction were rooted in trauma, that specific PTSD symptom clusters would be correlated along specific sexual dysfunction symptoms, or they'd be correlated with specific sexual dysfunctions along the sexual response cycle. For example, criteria C, avoidance, PTSD symptoms would predict low sexual desire. I'll now provide a bit of a context from the literature. Exposure to trauma in childhood is very common, as many of you may know. It occurs in about 20 to 48% of children, and exposure to potentially traumatic events occur in 18% of the general population. The prevalence of PTSD across the lifespan ranges from about 6 to 9% in the US And it's been found that 1/3 of these individuals will, with PTSD, will develop a chronic physical illness or disorder of somatization. Equally kind of unsettling is that sexual dysfunctions occur in about 43% of women and 31% of men. And it's been found that specific clusters of PTSD are correlated with difficulty in sexual functioning across the sexual response cycle. Example, desire, arousal, orgasm, with cluster D, cognitive affective, and cluster C, avoidance numbing, predicted of all types of sexual dysfunction in veterans. And I think that's one of the ways this study is different, is because the majority of the literature on the relationship between sexual dysfunctions and PTSD symptom clusters are in the veteran population, and we used a community sample. So understanding how post-traumatic stress symptom clusters are correlated with specific types of sexual functioning would be useful in both a basic and applied science. So where do we begin? In this research, 517 adults from the US were recruited through Prolific to participate in an anonymous online survey that included these measures. And these are standard measures in the study of human sexuality and dysfunction, listed here on the slide, as well as the PTSD checklist. And our demographics were, as you can see, primarily, well, equally about men and women, and majority were white. A series of hierarchical regression analysis were conducted with demographic covariates in step 1 and PTSD symptom clusters as predictors in step 2. The different types of sexual dysfunction symptoms as dependent variables. And results are reported here as if step 2 predicted the dependent variable significantly better than demographics. There are a number of notable findings in our study. So, consistent with expectations, PTSD symptoms overall were predictive of sexual dysfunction in men and women. For women, PTSD symptoms significantly predicted sexual desire and satisfaction. And more PTSD avoidance and cognitive affective symptoms and less PTSD intrusion and hyperarousal symptoms predicted lower desire and greater dissatisfaction. For women, fewer PTSD avoidance symptoms predicted less lubrication. For men, PTSD symptoms predicted overall sexual satisfaction and function and premature ejaculation. More PTSD cognitive affective symptoms were associated with dissatisfaction, overall sexual dysfunction, and premature ejaculation. More hyperarousal was associated with premature ejaculation. Less PTSD avoidance was associated with dissatisfaction and more dysfunction in men. To help make sense of this data, I provided a graphic that examines the PTSD symptom clusters along the sexual response cycle that we found in our research. In general, more PTSD symptoms in men and women led to less sexual satisfaction and function overall. Women were found to have the most significant relationship between PTSD symptom clusters and sexual desire. But the relationships were not as predicted. For example, less PTSD intrusion and hyperarousal symptoms predicted lower desire and greater dissatisfaction. Additionally, for men, it would be interesting to understand why PE would be the only sexual dysfunction with statistical significance. In summary, our hypotheses were partially true. The key message I'd like to leave you with is that, consistent with expectations, specific PTSD symptom clusters predicted sexual dysfunction symptoms in men and women. Results implied different mechanisms involved in sexual dysfunction symptoms in the context of symptoms of PTSD, but it's unclear why certain clusters did not impact sexual arousal and response. And this has important implications, not only in understanding how exposure to trauma impacts sexual functioning, but how this differs by sex. And the results also further support understanding the unique impacts of trauma and associated PTSD on the neurobiological development of sexual dysfunction. Thank you. Please feel free to contact me with any questions.